Hello and welcome to this tricky topics video for the paper 2 GCSE geography exam. Now, before I start the video, as usual, I would strongly recommend that you do make some notes throughout the video and pause at any key points. Most of the things that come from this video will likely be smaller 1, 2 and 4 mark questions. It's not going to cover the kind of big case study topics in much detail, but nonetheless, they are really useful for picking up some extra marks. So the first thing we're going to look at is looking at factors which affect the rate of urbanization. Now, this basically means what can cause the rate of cities growing becoming faster or becoming slower. Now, the first clear thing that affects it would be the amount of rural to urban migration. So, for example, if there is a war, that would increase the amount of rural to urban migration potentially if there's a famine, if there's a natural disaster, etc. as well. Or if the city has got more job opportunities, more education, it's going to increase that rural to urban migration. And the one that is usually overlooked by people in this exam is something called natural increase. Now, if you look at the little image on the screen there, you'll see that sometimes the number of births outweighs the number of deaths. And when that happens, we have something called natural increase. In LICs and NEEs in particular, because the birth rate is still very high and the death rate has fallen, we tend to see a lot of natural increase. That's why cities like Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and Lagos in Nigeria do have a significant amount of urbanization, urban growth, because of that natural increase. The next tricky topic is how urban industrial areas can be a stimulus for economic development. Now, this basically means how can the industrial, the kind of manufacturing or workplace parts of an urban area help economic development? Well, the first thing to really point out here is that cities and urban areas tend to have very good transport connections. If you consider London, Manchester, Liverpool to some extent, they're very easy to get around those cities on the underground, on buses, on trams, whatever it's going to be, and that helps trade and thus improving GDP per capita. Cities and urban industrial areas tend to have a very young workforce as well. And having that young, qualified, and educated as well by our workforce is really important. And I put that as a third point there. Now, if you combine these three things, the world-class education, so places like the University of Manchester, a young workforce with good transport connections, what that leads to is a multiplier effect. And it enables more business to enter an area because they've got those three things to help them out. That then means people have higher wages and hence a multiplier effect from that. Local business get more investment, spend more money, raise more tax, more investment in the economy again. The third tricky topic is the impact of urban sprawl on the rural-urban fringe and the growth of commuter settlements. Now, this is a part of the exam that always throws people. Urban sprawl is the outward growth of urban areas. As people move to urban areas, the need for land to build on increases, so the suburbs spread out. If you imagine the boundary of a city, urban sprawl means that boundary extends in size and it grows into the rural urban fringe, and that is the area between the city, the urban area, and the rural countryside. When that happens, we also have the growth of what are called commuter settlements. Now, a commuter settlement is a small town or village, usually, where the people living there have to get, or most of them will commute to a larger city for work. And in other words, we need to think about if loads and loads of people are moving to the rural urban fringe and we are having this massive growth of commuter settlements, what are the impacts of that going to be? There's going to be more people in these areas. Now, when we're thinking about impacts, I would always break it down into social, economic, and environmental. That's a really good way of doing the effects of something: social, economic, environmental. And on the screen there, you can see the causes of urban sprawl, which is similar to urbanization, and you've got the effects as well. So from an environmental standpoint, we're going to have loads more cars in those countryside areas, aren't we? Which is going to lead to more congestion, more air pollution. Social impact, that could leave health issues like breathing, etc. as well. We can have increases in out of town and business retail parks, more local employment for local people. And I'll leave you to read through the remaining list there. But essentially, an impact or an effect can be positive or negative. I suspect it is usually a balance of the two. But I would always look at these in terms of social, economic, and environmental. So when you see the impacts of the rural-urban fringe and the growth of communal settlements, these are the sort of things you need to be talking about. So it might be worth pausing the video and having a serious read of these before we move on. Okay. And the final little part to do with urbanisation and the rest of urbanisation, the two major case studies, in my case, Liverpool and Rio, you can find them on my other case study video. It's really important you have a look at that. And what this final point looks at are the features of sustainable urban living and transport. Now, sustainable urban living and transport basically means allowing people to continue with their needs right now. So, for example, the need to transport yourself to work or the need to live inside a city, having a limited impact on the environment, and not impacting the long-term sustainability, the long-term potential for people to do the same thing in the future. So what are some examples of sustainable transport then? Well, in Liverpool, they've recently introduced a new bus service which runs on a combination of hydrogen and electric. Why is that sustainable? Well, it allows people to be connected for trade and transport, but it has a limited impact on the environment due to less CO2 emissions from the exhaust, and it doesn't harm people in the future because it's contributing less to climate change, which will impact cities like Liverpool in the long term. It's also things like cycle lanes. So, for example, all along the Strand, that's one of the main roads in Liverpool, they've built in new cycle lanes. And you can see an example here. So on the right-hand side, you've got the Three Graces, the Maliva building. And along that, where that guy in the yellow jacket is there, that is a brand new cycle lane that has been built in the last 2 years. So they're brand new and they're great features of sustainable transport. Again, why are they sustainable? Well, cycling is like a double whammy. It takes cars off the road, reducing congestion and air pollution. It has, well, no CO2 emissions, even less than buses do. And also think of the health benefits as well in terms of everyday cycling. So your health also improves, making it more sustainable. And then finally, for urban living, we can look at places like Bedzed in London. Now, what do places like Bedzed in London do? Well, they have living gardens on the roof, which encourage biodiversity into the area. They have solar powered triple glazing insulation in the building to reduce their energy usage as well. They have heat ventilation systems. So that means the heating needs to go on less during the winter, and during the summer, they don't need air conditioning, all of which uses energy and money and therefore making it more sustainable. Again, if you'd like to read up more on Bedzed, please do have a little Google of it and look at some of the key features of that scheme. But those three things combine to give us urban living, Bedzed, and sustainable urban transport in the case of the hydrogen buses and cycle lanes. You could also talk there about integrated transport systems, such as the Mersey Pass, which is bus and train within the same price. Same idea. Okay. Now, if we go back a little bit here to the rural urban fringe, when we are growing out into these places, unfortunately, we're going to have to build over land that previously was not necessarily used for housing. Now, the first type of land we can build on in this urban sprawl is something called a greenfield site. Now, a greenfield site to you and I is essentially a field or maybe even a small woodland area as well. Now, before I even go on, you can probably think what the disadvantages of building on greenfield sites would already be, especially when we think about things like flooding risk, biodiversity, climate change, etc. The other option we have, and this is one of the things that have been really pushed by the UK government, is building on what is called a brownfield site. Now, a brownfield site is previous industrial land that is no longer used. It's usually derelict old land. And what you can do is you can clear the brownfield site and build new parts of your city. So, for example, Everton's brand new football stadium on the Bramley Moor Dock is a brownfield site. And places in the north, in particular, in Manchester and Liverpool, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of brownfield sites which could, in theory, be used for development, which prevents us having to build into greenfield areas. Now, I'm going to suggest you pause this video again because it gives you some of the advantages of both. But for greenfield sites, they're often on the edges where land is cheaper. There's a blank canvas and more space for gardens, which is a really big point. They often are close to motorways, and there's no need to clean up the previous land use. However, brownfield sites are significantly more sustainable as existing developed land is being used. They stop city expansion as they are already within the city, and this stops a loss of the countryside. The road networks, the gas, the electricity already exist, and they're also closer to that central business district, the closer of town for shopping and job opportunities. And again, I recommend you have a go at these two. Make sure you get some notes in these tables. Okay, moving on to section B then, which is the changing economic world. Now, the changing economic world starts off with this idea that there is something called uneven development. I'm going to get onto that in a second. To begin with, we're going to look at something called the demographic transition model. Now, the premise is fairly straightforward. Stage 1 is our least developed country, and stage 5 is our most developed country. The black line here shows death rate, and this blue coloured line here shows birth rate. The red line shows population increase. Now, in stage 1, and I'm thinking like indigenous tribes in Brazil here, the death rate is really, really high because we don't have access to modern medicine. We don't necessarily have vaccinations, anything like that. But also the birth rate's really, really high as well. Therefore, the population remains low. However, in stage 2, and this is where we start to get our LICs coming through, the birth rate remains really, really high. Now, the birth rate is still really, really high in stage 2 because the majority of women in particular are not being educated, they're not working in employment, they're still having large families. There may be limited access to family planning facilities and contraception. But the death rate is starting to drop. Aid from countries like the UK and the USA, malaria nets, vaccinations, medications, modern medicine is introduced during stage 2. And as that death rate drops, but the birth rate remains high, the population starts to increase quite dramatically. Now, in step stage 3, and stage 3 is your classic NEE, newly emerging economy. Countries like China fit into this category massively. Now, continue with our advancement in healthcare infrastructure. The amount of deaths continues to fall. But you'll notice the birth rate is also starting to fall now. Women are being emancipated. They are starting to have education up to a certain age. They are starting to enter the workplace. Family planning is more readily available. But even though the birth rate's dropping, it's still higher than the death rate, and so the population increases. The final stages are our HICs, stage 4 and 5. And now, in some places, the birth rate is actually dropping below the death rate. Places like Japan, which could lead, in theory, to a falling population in the long term. These projections are uncertain as they are based on statistics, but nonetheless, that is the demographic transition model. The stage from stage 1, indigenous populations, stage 2, LIC, stage 3, end of 2, NEEs, and then end of 4 and 5, HICs. Along the bottom, you'll also see some population pyramids. Now, population pyramids only actually look like a pyramid in the very poorest countries, and that's because there's loads and loads and loads of young people, not that many old people. Why is that? Really high birth rate, still quite high death rate. Loads of young, not many old. Flash forward to stage 5, loads and loads of old, not as many young. That's because death rate is now very, very, very low, hence why we've got a lot more old people. But also, in some parts, the birth rate's fallen so low that there isn't the number of births to support that population. That brings with it a whole host of problems, like, for example, in Japan, who are going to do the jobs? If we've got more old people than young people, who's going to look after them? Who's going to work for the NHS as a carer? Who's going to work as a teacher in these schools, etc. as well? And the other thing I want to point out on this video is something called the poverty trap or cycle. Now, we do a lot about positive multiplier effects, but there can be the opposite as well. If a country has low income, that generally means they're going to have very poor investment in infrastructure, like roads. If they have poor investment in infrastructure and roads, there's going to be low investment from outside of the country, leading to lower growth and lower income. In other words, if the country has low income and doesn't build the roads, the airports, the offices, the underground train stations that a big company like Coca-Cola or Apple need, they are not going to invest in that country, and therefore they can't grow or gain growth from that economy. Or it also leads to education and healthcare, low levels of human capital, low workforce productivity, less attractive to investors. So with this one, it's all about how low wealth can lead to issues with economic growth, which is wealth, or development, which in this case is health and education. And it does make sense if you think about it, because if a country has really low income, and let's say that there's really low levels of education, that low levels of education mean it's going to be less attractive to investors. If only 40% of my country can read and write, I might choose to grow my company somewhere that has a higher literacy rate, which means the country continues to have a low income. And the idea is here, and you might want to again look at these and pause the video, is that these traps are triggered, and once they happen, it's very, very hard to get out of them, unless you change the low income part at the beginning, which is where we're going to get onto in a minute. And that's why things like tourism are really, really encouraged from that. So, uneven development then basically means that some countries are really, really poor, LICs, and that's where this sort of thing is happening. At the other end of the spectrum, we have our HICs, high income countries, that are significantly wealthier, healthier, and better educated. And I've put some facts on the left-hand side to really show you that the world's richest 1% of people have more than twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion other people. Around half of humanity is still living on less than $5.50 a day. And of the 258 million children around the world, 1 out of every 5 will not be allowed to go to school. That is uneven development. Some places have very high wealth, health, and education, and some places do not. But why has this happened? What are the causes? Well, for physical reasons, it's things like the country being landlocked. In other words, if it is landlocked, it has no access to the ocean, so will have difficulty trading and getting inward investment for that country. If it is in a tropical region, they can get diseases such as malaria. If we get malaria, there's less people in work, there's more kids missing education, it leads to that cycle of poverty again. Okay? If we've got a lack of resources or the resource curse theory are all things that mean this country could have this uneven development. But it's not just physical causes, there's also historical or political ones, things like colonialism. The fact that the British Empire, in particular, took control of 25% of the land surface of the earth and exploited some of these countries economically. We know there's uneven development, but the consequences of that are huge. Now, on the left hand side, you can see that generally we're going to have a lower quality of health, wealth, and education, inequalities between them. Some children go to school, some children don't. Some children go on to earn lots of money, some don't. And if you are born in an LIC, you are more likely to be one of the don'ts than one of the do's on a global scale. But it's not just that impacts people, it can trigger mass migration and brain drain. Think about if you're in a country where you are significantly less healthy, less wealthy, less educated, you might do everything you can to get out of that country. And so mass migration occurs. We can have conflict or civil unrest where people are not happy with their standard of life. And so they turn on the government in addition to that as well. So there's our cause and consequences of uneven development. And a final point from me on this particular topic. I'm not going to cover it massively here, but we also have these solutions as well. Now, if we go back to my poverty cycle, the solution is always going to be about changing one part of this poverty cycle. Now, one solution is aid or foreign direct investment, and that leads to either higher investment from outside the country or, let's say, aid for malaria nets improves health of a country. Let's say we have tourism, which increases the income that a country has. Or let's say we have debt relief, where major countries like the UK forgive countries of the debts they owe, so they have more money to spend in infrastructure, therefore creating a positive multiplier effect out of this poverty cycle trap. So debt reduction, fair trade, free trade, microfinance loans, tourism, all alter one aspect of this poverty cycle or trap, enabling them to get out of it as such. But it's because of that that we have these consequences as well. Now, within the exam, you also need to look at a case study for section B. Now, we're going to talk about Nigeria here. And one part of the specification that's quite difficult is the wider political, social, cultural, and environmental context within which the country is placed. Now, in Nigeria, from a social standpoint, it is a multicultural and multi-faith country. It is a land of over 500 languages and ethnic groups. It also, unfortunately, from a political and social standpoint, harbors the terrorist group Boko Haram, which basically means against Western education, and hinders particularly female education in the north of the country. Culturally, Nigeria has the world's second largest film industry, which is actually ahead of the United States, Hollywood, and that's known as Nollywood. And environmentally, it spans multiple different climatic regions. We have rainforest areas, but also oil is massive in Nigeria as well. And so the development of oil could have significant environmental ramifications for the country moving forward. The other thing that is maybe potentially tricky is talking about how the effects of economic development on quality of life for the population. Now, this here shows a table of Nigeria between 1990 and 2017. Now you can clearly see that life expectancy goes up, the expected years of schooling goes up, the GNI goes up quite dramatically from 2,792 to 5,231, and the HDI, the Human Development Index, which combines your literacy rate, your GDP per capita, and your life expectancy, also increases. So, to answer this question, overall, economic development in Nigeria has improved wealth, health, and education for some, but not all, because 50% of the population still live in poverty. Oil revenues are high, but we still have conflict. We have wealth corruption of the government officials. We don't have full access to strong education and healthcare facilities. Yes, it has improved. 53.9 years versus 45.9. That's still low. Think about the UK there. So, yes, it has improved for some, but not for all. And the idea is it's people like Shell and investing in the jobs that then impact this. In this exam, if you are struggling, think about how more money, wealth, can improve people's health and people's education, and you won't be far off the mark. And then moving on to the UK's economy, then. Now, the next tricky topic is looking at deindustrialization and the move to the post industrial economy. Now, a post industrial economy is one that replaces manufacturing with service industries, also known as tertiary, plus the new knowledge economy, which is the quaternary industry. Now, if we go back to the 70s and 80s, the UK was an industrial economy. We relied on the secondary sector, and I'll give you an example here. In Liverpool, one of the main sectors was the docking industry. But after that sector collapsed, the UK's economy changed. And as of 2020, we are now in what's called the post industrial economy. 1.3 million people in the UK are employed in IT. Financial services, which is like accounting, investment banking, employs over 2 million people and accounts for 10% of the UK's GDP. We've also had the development and growth of science and business parks, and there are now over 100 in the UK employing 75,000 people. So the UK has had a very swift and clear change to the post industrial economy. And it's not only the economy that's changed, we are also trying to make what we do in this country, the remaining secondary industry, more environmentally sustainable. Now, the one example I would give you is the Tor Quarry in Somerset. And essentially, while we do have some industry remaining, they're trying to do everything they can to, again, limit the impact on the environment, but allow the actual activity to continue economically. So, what they're doing in the Tor Quarry in Somerset is they're regularly monitoring the noise, dust, and water quality to make sure they aren't polluting the environment. They've actually landscaped 200 acres where they've replanted gardens and trees. They've created wildlife lakes to encourage the biodiversity into the area. And they also used rail transport rather than lorries to move the rocks out, reducing congestion and air pollution. So even though there are some secondary industries that continue in the UK, they are trying to be more environmentally sustainable moving forward. Now, I'm going to flick back to this idea of the post-industrial economy. Now, unfortunately, when the docks closed in Liverpool, when the mills closed in Blackburn and Lancashire, when Sheffield lost its steel industry, or anywhere in the north, when that happened, the north was really, really slow to react. The north of England, Wales, Scotland to an extent, went into economic decline. However, London and the southeast quickly took up the post-industrial knowledge economy and were able to very quickly improve their standards of health, wealth, and education. Now, that has led to something called the North-South divide in England, where the North is significantly less healthy, less wealthy, and less educated than the South of England. But it's also led to things like Wales and Scotland also being, before this, poorer than England as well. So, what have they done? And the way they word this in the exam is resolving regional differences, and that essentially means differences in health, wealth, education in the different parts of the UK, north-south divide, England, Scotland, Wales, etc. Now, the first thing they've done to try and improve this is investment in infrastructure, in particular transport. Now, I've used the Liverpool 2 port here, and that's an example of improving trade. It creates over 5,000 jobs for the area. Great, great, great. There's also HS2, High Speed 2, which has its ups and downs. In many ways, it will help connect London with the rest of the country, but the costs of the project are massive and it will destroy huge areas of green belt land, if we go back to that word from earlier. And the idea is that they invest in infrastructure in the north, it will increase trade and cause positive multiplier effects to occur. Same idea here is something called a local enterprise partnership, an LEP. Now, places like Liverpool and Preston in Lancashire are using these extensively. And what they do is these LEPs provide money for local businesses, like little small loans, to help them get started up. That creates multiplier effects for the economy. And lastly, we have something called devolution. Now, devolution is where the power is taken away from the government in London and distributed out to different parts of the UK. So, for example, Yorkshire and the Humber have devolution, and they are given the money and they get to basically decide what they want to do with it. Same with Scotland and Wales. They are given more power to make their own laws, to spend money how they want. The idea being that they can then focus on things that they need to improve rather than, London deciding what's good for the rest of the country, basically. And those three things are attempting to resolve regional differences. And then moving on to the final section of this exam, the challenges of resource management. It looks at food, water, and energy in the UK, and then you just answer the water questions after that. I'll do another little video explaining the exam structure after this one. Now, the one thing that I think is quite hard, really, in the UK is something called the trend towards agribusiness. Now, agribusiness is basically when a farm is run like a large business and they are large scale, money intensive commercial activities. So, agribusiness is not one man on his farm with his dog and his tractor ploughing up and down and selling the proceeds to the local shop. Agribusiness is companies like Tesco or McDonald's paying a company that might run 100 farms in an area on a large scale basis. It gives them one price. Now, the positives of this are it does help with food security and it actually lowers consumer prices. Prices for agribusiness are significantly lower than they are for small scale farming because they are more streamlined businesses. However, agribusiness has had a much more larger impact on the environment, in particular the use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, which can have harmful impacts on biodiversity. And smaller farms have struggled to compete, and therefore we have had agricultural decline as there are fewer people that are now working on these farms. It's mostly machinery and the use of technology, which is providing work for more skilled people in that tertiary and quaternary sector, but the traditional farming jobs are disappearing and the environmental impacts are not necessarily brilliant for agribusiness. The other key issue facing the UK is the changing energy mix. Now, the energy mix is actually quite a straightforward concept. If we look at 2012 over here, this is how much EDF energy used to create their electricity. And you can see 26% in 2012 burning coal, 37% burning gas, and the rest coming from renewables, nuclear, oil, GT pump engines, whatever it's going to be. So the energy mix is if you take 100% of the energy use in that country, it tells you what the source is. Now, the clear change to me between 2012 and 2022 is that the amount of renewables have increased dramatically. 16%, we always use figures in the exam, 16% to 44%. The amount of coal has reduced massively from 26% to down to just 3%, but the amount of gas remains. So even though coal in particular has decreased massively, we are still reliant on fossil fuels, in particular gas, but there has been a growth of the amount of renewables we are using. So why is that? Why has coal dropped so massively and renewables started to increase? Well, the main one is government policy. So the government and their policies are looking at climate change and international agreements and wanting to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. Consumer demand, people like myself or your parents or your grandparents might choose companies that produce their electricity from renewable energy. And therefore, if more people want that, then the companies have to change to keep up with demand. Renewable technology, there's more technology nowadays and it's becoming significantly cheaper. And there is better infrastructure now for renewables. Owning an electric car, for example, is easier today than it was 5 years ago. There are now charging points at most supermarkets. That infrastructure is significantly better for those renewable energies. However, just to really link this one more time back with the UK's economy, if we look at Liverpool, for example, and the collapse of that secondary sector, if we link this in with St Helens, the decline of coal had a huge impact on the town. So as the UK's reliance on fossil fuels goes down, that did have a quite severe economic impact in terms of people losing their jobs, entering cycles of decline in places like St Helens. But on the flip side, the jobs in wind and solar in particular are now extremely, extremely high paying. They are very, very high paying. But we are not going to move away from renewables anytime soon. They are still the most reliable, they are still the cheapest on average, and we still don't have the full infrastructure to rely purely on wind and solar. And like I said, they're not that reliable anyway, really, yet. And then the last thing on this little video is looking at water in particular. And I was going to focus on water transfer schemes, water deficit and surplus, but equally I think that's quite straightforward. But this one might throw people, the factors affecting water availability. So the first and most obvious factor that affects water availability is the climate. So for example, if we have an arid climate like the Middle East and the Sahel region, we're going to have very low precipitation and therefore we're going to have water deficit and potentially water insecurity as well. The other reason, and it's similar to flooding, is the geology of how impermeable or permeable the rock is. In some parts of the world where the rock is permeable, the water runs straight into rivers. In other parts where it isn't absorbed, the aquifers can't build up, and so we have water supply issues. But it isn't just water availability in terms of physical factors, while it is the main reason. Another big thing is the infrastructure available. The Congo in Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, has one of the wettest climates in the world. In fact, it receives significantly more water than the UK does. However, it is significantly more water insecure. Why is that? Well, they lack the infrastructure for sanitation, for example. So that picture there is a sanitation plant where they treat the water, where they make sure that it's safe for drinking. Do they have the pipes to transfer to people's homes? Do people's homes have the plumbing and installations needed so they can just turn on a tap and use water? Often in LICs, that is not the case. And finally, and this one is also overlooked, unfortunately, is water pollution as well. You might have seen in the news that a lot of the British coastlines have been polluted recently. And in places like China and India in particular as well, while they have large water sources in those rivers, all the factories along the rivers are leading to industrial waste and water pollution, reducing water availability. And if we think about Rio de Janeiro, a lot of these pipes of water sources run through the favelas, which are unregulated. We can have human waste, we can have chemical waste end up in this water supply, which can lead to health and environmental issues as well. Thank you for watching this video. That is everything today. I would strongly recommend that you go back and have a flick through of any of the topics that you weren't exactly clear on as I'm going through here. And as I say, there is a case study video. Case studies for paper 2 are the most important thing. I'd advise watching that video a couple of times or definitely making some notes and revising using flashcards, testing off that. And also as well, I'll add on a quick flick through of the paper 2 exam just to show you what to expect as well.